Enterprise. Oh, sorry. Okay. Um, so with thanks to Shlomo for he sent me a copy of his Devar on Joseph, covering a lot of the same ground that we looked at, I guess, in the last 2 weeks. But I wanted to come back to one particular thing. As we last week at the end of our time, we were just talking for a few minutes about the Hebrew of the Torah and how many layers of meaning are somehow embedded just in the Hebrew language of it. Forget about unpacking the commentaries of the generations, etc. So let me just find where this is. Yeah, here we go. Actually, I have it here. There. Okay. So just look with me at the end of Shlomo's drash. How do I share screen? Here. And Shlomo, would you read this for us? This is your writing. Oh.
The writers of Torah are so incredibly good at their craft. At the critical moment when the brothers show the bloody tunic to Jacob, they say, Hakerna, do you recognize? In the Judah Tamar episode, when Judah is ready to burn that harlot Tamar, she shows him his tunic and says to Judah, Hakerna, do you recognize this tunic?
Mm-hmm.
I love the use of the same words at these two critical moments. And I want to believe that the authors are telling us that in critical moments of our own lives, we should look around, explore, recognize what is going on, and then act if action is needed.
Mm. Kol hakavod. Thank you. So I wanted to just dwell on this. Shlomo's highlighting this little phrase, hakerna, which came up last week in our Torah study as well. And Shlomo just added to it the same thing that I believe it was Rashi who commented on this. The use of this word, excuse me, I think it was actually Aviva Zornberg. Sorry, it's easy for me to confuse the two of them, right? Because they're not at all. Um, the use of this same root, which is nakar in its basic form, the root, to recognize, but which is also, it's the same root that is used to be a stranger. When Joseph sees his brothers for the first time in last week's parasha, it says, hit naker. He makes himself a stranger. He makes himself unknown to them. And it's just this marvelous way that the same root has two opposite sides almost, to draw our attention to the ways in which so many things are two sides of the same coin. So just wanted to highlight that again and just enjoy the beauty of that, to recognize and also to completely not to know are sort of somehow two sides of the same thing. Okay, so to go forward this week, Vayigash, and I want to look with you, as we've been doing each week, towards the latter part of the parsha. And so here we go. This week, Parashat Vayigash, and our title is Food, Glorious Food. And if it's not obvious what that's about, it's about to become obvious. This latter section of the parasha, which brings us almost to the end of the parasha, Joseph has welcomed the brothers. He has revealed himself. This very dramatic moment at the beginning of Parashat Vayigash. Almost breaks your heart not to focus on that, but we will have other years to do that. Towards the end of the parasha, he's now continuing in his role as chief overseer of the distribution of food rations and somehow guiding the land of Egypt through this horrific famine. It's the whole region. It's not just the land of Egypt. So let's look at this section from the Torah itself, chapter 47. V'lechem ein b'chol haaretz, Ki kaved hara'av me'od. There was no bread in all the land. There was no, in this case, bread has to stand for more than just bread, but at least bread. Ki kaved harav. The famine was, kaved is like heavy, intense. Me'od, it was very weighty. Vatela eretz Mitzrayim ve'eretz Canaan mipnei hara'av. And the lands of Egypt and Canaan were suffering, were, the translation here, languishing.
You
And
think that's related to Leah's name?
Vatela, I
To be
mean,
weakened, to be weakened?
uh-huh. Maybe, but then wouldn't it have an aleph in it? Leah? I don't know.
Well, an aleph is a letter that is a weak letter which frequently drops out. But okay.
I don't know. Could be. I mean, what did they say about Leah? That she had weak eyes. So maybe. Okay, and then look at verse 14, as if the text is trying to keep us in this mode of, again, the sense of harvesting and gathering food at the same time that there is no food to be gathered. Vayilaket. It's so interesting the way the text does this. Vayilaket Yosef et kol hakesef hanimtza. Leket means harvest or gathering of food. It's, I don't know, it almost jumps out at you as sort of an intentional choice that they're using here. Maybe not usually use it in connection with collecting money. Like maybe you would say safe, to gather in the money, or I'm not sure what other word you would use to collect the money, but vayilaket, okay, is usually a word used with harvesting. So it seems to me at least that the author is saying the main issue here is food and the lack of food. Vayilaket Yosef et kol hakesef hanimtza be'eretz Mitzrayim u'be'eretz Canaan b'shever. Remember this word shever, which is like sustenance, produce, resources. Asher hem shovrim, same word, shovrim. Vayave Yosef et hakesef beta paro. So Joseph is gathering in all the money as payment for these food rations that are being given out. And then I actually am not planning to read through this whole passage, but I just wanted to kind of show it here, I guess. It's this confounding passage in which Joseph, step by step, strips the people of the land of everything they own. You know, one at a time, like one layer at a time. They come back to him and say, now we have no livestock because we've given you our livestock in exchange for food. Now we have no land. Finally, look at verse 19. Lama namut le'necha gam anachnu gam admatenu. The people of Egypt are saying to Joseph, apparently, don't let it not be that we die right in front of your eyes, not us and our land. Kne otanu ve'et admatenu belachem. Purchase us, like buy us and our land, in exchange for lachem, this bread, sustenance. V'niyeh anachnu ve'admatenu avadim lefaro. And so we will place ourselves and our land as servants, slaves perhaps, to Pharaoh. V'tein zera v'niyeh v'lo namut ha'adama. Lo tesham. Let us be in this servant relationship. Give us some seed and we will plant, and hopefully we won't die that way. And Joseph agrees to this rather shocking exchange of wealth, if you could call it that. So now we come to the end of this section where the government owns the people. The government owns the land. The government owns everything. And let's come to the end here. Let's go to verse 24. V'haya batvuot unetatem chamishit lefaro. So Joseph says, let's organize it this way. When you are able to harvest, you'll give 1/5, chamishit, lefaro ve'arba, sorry, my glasses are not working for me, hayadot yeh lachem lezera hasadeh. The 4/5 will remain with you and be food for your house, in your hands, literally, and in your homes. Le'echol letapchem, to feed your children. So we end with the at least the way our Torah author wants us to see this. The Egyptians are just grateful to Joseph and feel that he has saved their lives. And I don't know, to our modern eye, it's difficult to read this because it looks like, yes, he has saved their lives, but in doing so, he has stripped them of any personal agency they might have and made them in this state of servitude towards the administration that he serves. And then just look at the end with me, verse 26, Vayasem ota Yosef lechok ad hayom hazeh. Joseph made this into a land in Egypt still until today, it says, ad hayom hazeh, al admat Mitzrayim lefaro, lechomesh rak admat kohanim levadam. Only the priests did not become the ownership of Pharaoh, and this is clearly the author, one of the authors of the Torah, already starting to tease us, or ask us to notice that the priestly class has their own set of rules, and of course we hear much more detail about that later in the Torah. And then verse 27, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen. And then look at this word, this verb here, Vaye'achazu ba, Vayifru vayirbu ma'od. Okay, so just take note of that. We're going to come back to that. Vaye'achazu ba. Le'choz is to grasp or to hold on to something. Okay. So I want to scroll down here for a minute first. This is Marcia Falk's modernized composition of Birkat Hamazon. And I was thinking about this so much in the context of what it is to live in a time of scarcity, in a famine, as the Torah is saying. So she writes, and she's basing this completely on the traditional Birkat Hamazon text, that we might say in her words, Nodeh le'en hachayim, we are grateful to that source of life, Hazana et hakol. So in this construction, God is called the one that provides food for everything, sustenance for everything. We're used to hearing it, Hazan et hakol is in the traditional, more masculine version. So just to dwell on this for a moment, and hear how our tradition wants us to understand the experience of being fed. It's meant to be an experience of God's presence. We say a blessing before we eat, and then we say a blessing after we eat, a blessing of gratitude. It takes us, whenever I encounter this, I think it takes us right back to our first experience as human beings on the planet. I mean, as brand new infants, what's the first thing that we come to learn, if we're fortunate? I'm just going to turn off the share for a second. The very first thing we learn as new babies on the planet is that if we cry out in hunger, someone will feed us. And that's how we learn to trust that the world is a safe and good place for us. And it seems such a basic, essential lesson that we carry on through our lives. And now here we are looking at a piece of text, as we were last week, which is in the backdrop, again, in sort of the theater of a famine. And want to just focus for a few moments now on the psychological impact of living in a time of scarcity, living in a time when you can't trust that there's going to be enough. Okay, so let me go back to the share. Okay. Scrolling back up now to see some of our commentaries. Rashi just reminds us that this moment here that we're reading at the end of Vayigash, V'lechem ein b'chol haaretz, which we just had at the beginning of our passage, Choser li'inyan harishon. It just connects us back to the beginning of this segment of the Torah, which we read last week, when there's a famine in the land, and Jacob, remember we read this last week, he says, Yesh shever b'mitzrayim, and the rabbis play with that word shever and think, well, you could read it as sever, like there's something, there's a very important solution, an answer, an interesting inquiry to make in the land of Egypt. And they want you to read it as Jacob somehow knows that it's time to go find Joseph. I mean, he doesn't know it consciously, but he's sort of suggesting it unconsciously. Anyway, Rashi here is just saying, we're still in the same important, overarching, overwhelming context of hunger, of scarcity. Okay, now look at this. So interesting. And it's so fascinating to me that these are commentators from many, many generations ago, and they're still tuned in to some of the same questions of our experience as humans. I guess that's been the case for as long as humanity has been around. V'lechem ein ba'aretz, the same ki kaved hara'av. He's quoting here, the famine was strong, weighty, heavy, intense. Perush v'leitzad koved hara'av hayu ochlim davar mofli. Let's go over here. The Torah informs us of the psychology of hunger. During a famine, people have a tendency to eat inordinate amounts of food, thus causing their reserves of food to be depleted prematurely. The author describes a personal experience of famine in the country he lived in, where a person ate 10 times the amount of food he would eat normally and still felt hungry. So again, just stopping the share till we can look at each other. Think of how you feel when you have to fast. Either for a fast in the Jewish calendar, or maybe even you've had to fast for a medical reason. And you may have many other days in your life where you eat the same amount of food, but that day, because you're telling yourself you're not allowed to have any food, all you can think about is eating. I mean, I've had so many people say to me, I can't, Yom Kippur, how do you do it? You know, all you want to think about all day is when your meal is, when is break the fast, you know. When in fact, it's one day. It's, you know, you're not going to die from not eating unless you have, you know, we all do our own thing, and that's completely fine. People have medical reasons that they don't fast. But just noticing the psychology of fasting, which is, I think, the closest we fortunate people can get to what the experience of a famine is. We have lived through a famine in our community. I hope we don't have to, but we certainly live in a place where we know there are people in our midst who are hungry. And the commentator here, the Orach Chaim, is saying, you know, when you're hungry, you tend to feel like you need to eat a lot because you don't trust that there's going to be something there for you when it is time to eat. It's kind of like, you know, let's take provisions with us in case. Okay, let me go back. Share. Yes, can everybody see this? Sorry, I'm not seeing all of you, so I can't tell. Yeah, okay. Okay. So this is the word that Shlomo was asking about, vatela. Radak, this is David Kimchi. Inyan shigaon. He says it's a word describing a mental disturbance. Ki mipnei hara'av yishta'ag ha'adam. Famine has that impact on people. People become disturbed. The dagesh in the first root letter also indicates that meaning, and he finds a quote from Proverbs, like a madman who throws firebrands, playing with that same root word right here, vatela. So again, focusing on this notion that the presence of the famine isn't just a biological issue. It isn't just a sort of a concrete physical issue. In fact, maybe the main thing is the impact it's having on everybody's ability to be psychologically stable, to feel mentally stable. which makes sense. Again, when you're hungry, you feel like things are coming apart at the seams. I'm sort of laughing at myself saying this. Um, I, from childhood, my mother would recognize me as one who became hangry very quickly. And she would say, "Oh, looks like it's time for a snack." And she would mostly be right. And I still to this day can get very dysregulated if I haven't had at least something to eat. And my colleagues here at the synagogue can tell you I'm often wandering the halls going, "Does anyone have a snack? Is there anything around here to eat?" Luckily, there often is, although it's not always the healthiest stuff. Uh, okay, and then um, one more commentary from our traditional sources, Siftei Chachamim this time. This is also on this thing of uh, going back to the Rashi, that this mention of the famine, or it's not even a mention, this is really the whole story is taking place within the famine. The famine ceased when Yaakov came to Egypt, as Rashi soon explains. So in this part of the Torah, Joseph is about to settle his whole family in Egypt. We know that they eventually land in this region called Goshen. And as Joseph was the one who helped connect the family with Jacob, this is what I meant to say, Yaakov. When Jacob first mentions the famine in last week's section that we read, he's the one that invokes the famine as the reason that the family is going to reconnect. And it's here now the Siftei Chachamim is suggesting that the famine is going to ease up when Jacob lands in Egypt. So it's just sort of bringing things full circle. Okay. This is just a little bit of language from Webb, MD, my favorite medical practitioner. No, I'm kidding. Don't use WebMD for your medical practice. But what happens when there's this scarcity mentality? What happens to us? So these internet experts suggest our IQ becomes lower. They say by as many as 14 points, which may not seem like much, but it's enough to make a difference. It's enough to be noticeable. If you haven't had enough to eat, you can't think straight. It affects our ability to solve problems, to remember important information, even to reason logically. It impacts our ability to plan, to focus, to even to delay gratification, as we saw earlier in the David Kimchi comment, that when we're in a mindset of scarcity and hunger, we probably are likely to actually eat more than we need because we don't trust that there's going to be, so we can't even plan properly. We're just like living in the moment, very impulsive. And apropos of which, makes impulse control much harder. So the decision-making part of our brain also controls our impulses. And when this tunnel vision that comes with hunger or with scarcity, that scarcity mentality, reduces our brain function, we're more likely to give into impulses we probably shouldn't give into. And you see some of this playing out with these Egyptians here in the Torah, who are just like, it's almost as if they're just saying, here, take it all. We just have to have something to eat. And I don't mean at all to dismiss the urgency of that, but it lands them in a rather precarious position. And in fact, it pushes Joseph and Pharaoh, by extension, into a really complicated leadership position, as they have, layer by layer, stripped everything they own down to their own selves. They, as they say here, they have sold themselves into servitude to the Pharaoh and to Joseph. So let me pause here. I have some more that I want to look at with you, but just want to pause here and invite any thoughts, comments, questions about this scarcity mentality as it's being depicted in the Torah passage, in this difficult interaction between Joseph and the citizens he's trying to serve and trying to save, but ultimately enslaves. Go ahead, Audrey and Bob.
I just have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Why did, if Joseph was prepared and the Pharaoh was prepared and they had these silos full of grains and they had worked to make sure they would have plenty, why didn't they just open it all up and let people have it instead of the people having to kind of basically give up everything and become enslaved and all of that? I mean, why was that relationship?
Yeah.
Why did that happen?
It's, I mean, I'm asking the same question, and many of the commentators ask the same question. Even in a few minutes, I'm going to share with you something from Shai Held, and he's quoting others who are saying, you know, on the one hand, Joseph did take care of the momentary need. He made sure that people had enough to eat for today, at least, but he rendered people, what's the word I'm looking for? He rendered them powerless,
Right.
so that there was no sense of ownership among the community, which is a dangerous place to go.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a great question. There's no beholden. Thank you, Steve. Go ahead, Bob.
You know, it reminds me about, you know, this year and last year's discussions about unconscious racism.
Mm-hmm.
The story is told dispassionately. It's not condemned.
Mm-hmm.
It's not lauded. There's a hint that it's a good thing. The outcome is a good thing, but it's just told without any particular emotion. And it's as if, which I think is true, though, you know, the writers of it did not feel that it was condemnatory. And, you know, we can look at it with a modern eye, but I think we need to look at it both ways. You know, what was sort of the sociology of the time and how they saw themselves, and then how we would look back and reconstruct, you know, what that means, and have some look at it with a jaundiced eye.
With a jaundiced eye. That's a great way to put it. Thank you. I have a different part of the Shai Held commentary in the source sheet here, but I wanted to read you something. Some scholars defend Joseph and even heap praise upon him, noting that, quote, each time the citizenry give Joseph something of theirs, he gives back something of value. In exchange for their money, he gives them food rations. In exchange for their cattle, he gives them food. In exchange for their land and person, he gives them seed. Though enslavement sounds harsh, they argue, it was in this situation beneficial. So, and he's quoting other, he's not saying this himself. You notice that he says, some scholars defend, which is a kind of a diplomatic way of saying, I don't agree, but others say this. And of course, the commentators, the classical commentators on the Torah are always defending the Torah. I mean, they always want to portray the ancestors in the best light that they can. So in classical commentary, Joseph is depicted here as doing right by the Egyptians and making sure that they had enough food. Although it's interesting to note, some of these commentaries that we looked at sort of didn't even mention Joseph. They just talked about the challenging mentality of hunger. So they sort of focus on the suffering that's going on, not the response that's coming. So Jerry, you've got your hand up. Let me just go. I just am doing people in the order that I see them. So Shlomo, then Gil, then Jerry. Just don't forget to unmute.
I think the writers of the Torah need this to happen,
Yeah.
as to pre-shadow and to possibly even explain our own enslavement.
Correct.
Once, I mean, we have to look at that last sentence. All of Egypt, of what we've been reading, all of Egypt is enslaved, but the Hebrews in Goshen are
Right.
prospering and multiplying. And finally, when a Pharaoh doesn't recognize Joseph anymore, the Pharaoh just follows Joseph's steps and enslaves the Hebrews in Goshen.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting, where I think we mentioned last week or several weeks ago, where Jacob puts the death curse on Rachel
Hmm.
when she's hiding the teraphim. And
Right.
here Joseph sets up the whole thing for the children of Israel to be enslaved.
Yeah,
It's
what an interesting analogy to make. I was sitting here thinking, darn it, Shlomo. That's just where we're going. Well, we'll get there in a second, but thank you for the heads up. I love the analogy you're making because I think both are completely unknowing. I mean, Jacob certainly doesn't mean to sentence his wife to death, and Joseph certainly doesn't mean to sentence his future to this horrible, situation of slavery and persecution and death. I was going to start today. I didn't make time to bring the correct citation into the source sheet, but as we know, this is also the fulfillment of the prophecy given in the time of Abraham, that your descendants are going to go down to Egypt and are going to, I think that the English translation is often sojourn there. Here we go. It's happening right now, and yes, I think the setup is here. So we're going to come back and look at that in a second with some additional commentary. Go ahead, Gil.
Yeah, I like that, Shlomo. It's interesting that the first time a Hebrew gets into authority, he just uses the authority to its end. I mean, he is, the other, maybe that's why Joseph is not one of our ancestors, because the other three ancestors were pastoralists. Whatever they did, he became vizier, and look what he did. And maybe also the story is here to explain to people who lived at the time that this was written down why the Egyptians were the way they were. It's an origin story.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, the last thing I thought about reading this is, of course, the Assyrian exile. Well, the Assyrians moved people all over the world to get them away from their original homes, which is part of what Joseph did was move people around to make sure that farms were completely occupied and everybody was farming.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of pieces to it. But Joseph is just like everybody else, like Pharaoh. He's just a tool of God. He's being used by God to fulfill the prophecy.
Well, but certainly that's how he sees himself. I mean, he says that to his
But I'm
brothers.
talking about the bigger prophecy that he doesn't see. The
Oh,
one,
I see. I see.
the
I was
bigger
going to
one.
say,
Of course, none of them know this. And did God say that to Jacob, that his descendants would be slaves in Egypt? Did they ever say that to him?
um,
I don't
I
remember
don't,
that.
I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look, and I don't know whether it comes up to Abraham or to Jacob when God speaks to both of those ancestors. I don't know that they actually that mention of slavery comes up. It just says you will be subordinated. The
Okay.
your descendants will be subordinated to a foreign ruler. Um, wow, there's so many things that you went by with so many good things there, Gil. So, and I also see Steve chiming in. I think it was Steve who was saying absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's like, well, you were saying Joseph goes to all the way to the extreme. He doesn't sort of use his power in a titrated way. He says, Let's go. Let's just keep going until there's nothing left to give, and the balance of power is so completely thrown off. So I think it's interesting, Gil, that you're saying maybe this is one of the reasons that Joseph is not included in when we recite our ancestors as part of the Amidah, or at other times we don't mention him. And, I've always, for years, I've wondered, why don't we? Because he has so many other beautiful things that he brings to the family trajectory, but he's left out of the original 7. And maybe it's also because who knows, when the Sidurim when the liturgy was being compiled, it was already during the time of maybe Ezra and Nehemiah, and intermarriage was looked askance at. And Joseph is not married from within the tribe. He's married outside. I don't know if that's part of a reason. Jerry, go ahead. Jerry,
Can you not hear me?
first say something
Um,
again.
I'm
Now,
off mute. Oh, you can't hear me. Okay. Yeah, this is on one hand, this is disturbingly similar to modern times in places like Venezuela, perhaps Ethiopia, where leaders use food, hunger, famine as a political weapon, right, to get power. And
Mhm.
Joseph looks uncomfortably like some of these leaders of today. who use this. But in some defense of Joseph, he's serving Pharaoh in these actions, I believe. He's not, he may be benefiting indirectly, but it all says the land's coming to Pharaoh, right? It seems to me. And this may be part of the setup that Shlomo talked about, is that, don't blame Joseph so much for all this. He's serving Pharaoh, right? So it's Pharaoh maybe is being set up as the foil in a sense, or who will become, I know it's a different Pharaoh later, but associating Pharaoh with this behavior more than Joseph, perhaps.
Yeah, and Jerry and everybody, as part of the defense of Joseph among many of the classical commentators, they make the point that he's not doing all these maneuvers to increase his own wealth. He doesn't keep any of it for himself. It's all he's just doing his job as vice president, and doing it, to its fullest manifestation. So thank you, Steve, Bruce, and then I'd like to come back to one more thing.
Yeah, I'll just riff on what you just said. He's doing it for the glory of the nation, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And its prestige in the world, all this kind of thing to be brought in. What I wanted to ask about is, this and I was reflecting on my father's blessing every Shabbat. May you be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Not Ephraim and Manasseh, by the way, Joseph's sons, but just Ephraim and Manasseh. And is there anything other than commentary that talks about how Ephraim and Manasseh came to the fore and Joseph was not listed as having a tribe? Is it just later interpretation that means even greater appreciation of Joseph because God's recognizing the sons?
Right.
But is that really the way to interpret it?
Well, I don't know if that's the way to interpret it, but that is, the line of Joseph gets a double portion of the land allotment, and Jacob extends his blessing not just to Joseph, but all the way to Joseph's children, which he doesn't seem to do at least in the text.
But do we know that he extends a blessing to Joseph?
Does he extend a blessing to Joseph? I'd have to go back and look. I haven't looked at Vayechi in a whole year, so I don't know. That last parasha where he's blessing his descendants, and when he does this exact thing that you're talking about, of blessing his two grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. It seems to me that he doesn't say anything to Joseph, but I don't trust myself on that, so I'd want to go back and look. I don't know. Somebody else can look if they want to. Gil is chiming in here. By having two tribes, Joseph gets a double portion. Right. Usually reserved for the eldest son. Right. He's the eldest son of Rachel. So he's not the eldest of all of them, but he is the eldest of the one that Jacob loved, especially. Although I keep hoping that at some point he came to appreciate Leah. I hope he did. Bruce, go ahead.
I don't know what the economic conditions were in Egypt in general, but looking at countries that flood all the time, the Delta, Bangladesh is a country like this, similar to Egypt. Okay, more than half the people are in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
They're hungry more than half the years. Only during the harvest season, there's adequate food for them to eat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the Torah is speaking to the wealthy Egyptians. This may be the first time that they have been suffering.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so I assume even that among the Jews, most of them did not go past Cheder, if they studied at all, just the men. And they were very poor, just being able to survive at a subsistence level.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so it seems like this is a story for the middle class, upper middle class, learned people, with the Kohanim above it, and speaking as if this is for all the people.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory that it says the famine was, what does it say? Kaved me'od. Like the famine was now, it wasn't just a famine for the people who were vulnerable. It impacted everyone, even the wealthy. And if you carry this theory even further, you could say, well, how did they have resources to trade with in the first place? How did they have what to pay Joseph with in the first place? It must have been that there was some wealth there to pay him with. So it's interesting what you're saying.
Well, also during the years of plenty, how did Pharaoh, Joseph, amass all of these food stores? Did they pay the people, or was it a tax imposed upon them?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, Joseph apparently comes up with this plan, but we don't know exactly how it was enacted. Or maybe we do. Maybe I'm just not knowledgeable. But thank you for the question. I want to go back now to a couple of other things, and this Shlomo started to hint at this with us, or maybe even more than hint. First, look with me at this. This is from Shai Held's commentary on this parasha, and this is just kind of, I think, wrapping up some of what we've been talking about in the last few minutes. He says, "Faithful service to Pharaoh does not necessarily righteousness make." What of Joseph's treatment of the Egyptian people? Joseph does indeed save lives, which is no small feat in the midst of a widespread famine, and yet the reader is left to wonder just how many of the steps Joseph takes are really necessary. Feeding the Egyptians is one thing, but progressively stripping them of everything they have is seemingly another. In what is perhaps another irony, the Israelites themselves will soon find out that being fed by one's owner creates an unhealthy and undignified sense of dependence. I got to read that again. The Israelites themselves will soon find out that being fed by one's owner creates an unhealthy and undignified sense of dependence, keeping one bound to one's oppressor. So he's going, Shlomo, right where you were, which is there's something of a literary premonition going on here, where the Exodus story is already being hinted at, and whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. Maybe, and maybe not. So let me scroll up. You all, does it make you nauseous when I do all this scrolling back and forth? I don't mean to do that. Okay, good. Audrey's saying no at least. So just look one more time at the ending, the two last sentences here. Actually, just the last sentence. This is 27. Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. Israel, in this case meaning Jacob and all the children of Jacob, began to be settled in the land of Egypt, be'eretz Goshen, in this particular region, Vaye'achazu ba. It says here they acquired holdings in it, but I can't help but think of this. Le'echoz is to hold on to something, to grasp it. I mean, so maybe it's poetic that the English here is saying they acquired holdings in it. I think there's even something more somehow of I don't know, grasping, which has an intensity to it. And then vayifru vayirbu me'od, and under their tenure there, the land was fertile. They were fertile, and they increased greatly. So you see right there the original commandment from Genesis, pru, oravu, be fruitful and multiply, which is going to get exaggerated in the story of the Exodus, which I'll come to in just a second. Okay, so the hint already is here that the future slavery is being seeded right now, like a seed. It's being planted and seeded, and in some ways nurtured. Bear with me as I just come to here. So two things from Chizkuni. V'ye'echazu ba. He's commenting on this little phrase. They became totally attached to it. So I like that translation better than they acquired holdings in it. They acquired holdings make it sound like a very dispassionate real estate interaction. But at least the way I'm hearing the language is something they became really attached there. Kanu sham nachala va'achuzah. They acquired land that served as the ancestral heritage. And you almost feel in Chizkuni's commentary here that that was like part of an Aveirah, part of a transgression, that they became so attached to this foreign land that they began to think of it as their ancestral homeland, which it never was meant to be. And then Chizkuni goes on in the next verse, Vayifru vayirbu. They were fruitful and they multiplied. L'kayem ma shene'emar, ki legoy gadol asimech sham. So this is fulfilling, well, this language comes up several times. This is fulfilling God's promise to Yaakov in chapter 46. So he's just saying here at the end, this completes Parashat Vayigash. But the point is that this language here is important for us. They were fruitful and they multiplied. When you look at the beginning of Exodus, and I don't have it here on the source sheet, but when you look at the beginning of Exodus, it uses the same language, and it becomes a real curse for the children of Israel who are there. Because they were fruitful and multiplied, because they were so successful there, they become fearsome to the new king. As you're all shaking your heads, you know this story very well. They become a source of concern. And it's in the beginning of Exodus that you also hear.
I don't hear you.
What? Can you all hear me? Shlomo, you can't hear us? You can hear me now. Okay.
I hear you.
Okay. I don't know, maybe just a momentary. I was going to say it's also in Exodus that you hear another echo of Genesis. I think it's in Exodus that the Pharaoh says, Vayirbu vayishritzu. The children of Israel were like multiplying so fast, they were like a swarm of insects, which is how the creation of the creepy crawling things is described in Genesis. Like that's how the new Pharaoh is seeing this immigrant group. They're no longer immigrants at that point. They've already decided this is their ancestral homeland. So it's a danger point, a tipping point for Israel. Even though they finally have landed in a place of safety, reconciliation with Joseph, the family rupture is finally being healed, and here's Joseph pronouncing it all under God's dominion, and and they all lived happily ever after. But in fact, we know that we turned the page and it wasn't that way. So it just makes the text extra rich for us to see that, just when you think you finally have landed, there's another chapter already beginning and a new set of challenges that are going to present themselves to you. But before we wrap up for today, I'd like to come one last time to this Birkat Hamazon. Here. I don't think I can fit, I can almost fit the English and the Hebrew on the same page there. So again, this is Marcia Falk's modernized and streamlined, seriously streamlined, into just 3 couplets. I love it because it's like a pocket Birkat Hamazon. You can take it with you. All you have to do is memorize it, and you got a good Birkat Hamazon on your hands. And you allow yourself to reconnect. By reciting this, you allow yourself to reconnect with this phrase, among others, that God is the one that provides sustenance for all. Of course, we would say, hang on as I lose my voice here. We would say we have to be the hands of God. Obviously, God is not going to go out and grow the wheat and harvest the wheat and, turn it into something that's edible. We have to do all of that. But it starts there with that original trust relationship that we always want to affirm when we eat. So I'd like to sing through this with you. I created a simple melody, intentionally simple, not meant to be artistic or fancy, but just simple so that you could remember the words, because that's one of the ways we remember a set of words. Okay, so my version goes like this. Nodeh le'ein hachayim, hazana et hakol, al haaretz hatova ve'harchava, נשמור נא, נשמור נא, והיא תקיימנו, ונבקש מזון להשביע בו, כל יושבי תבל. So look with me a little bit, another moment at these words. We're grateful to the source of life, which is the one that provides, feeds, provides sustenance for everything. For the land, the good land, which is expansive, harchava. Nishmorna, we will guard her, guard the land, vihi tekaimenu. And in return, she will sustain us. She will help us hang around and endure and be okay. Univakesh, whoops, that should be a vet there. Univakesh mazon lehasbiabo. And so we request or beckon mazon, food resources, lehasbiabo, for the full satisfaction. Think of how good it feels when you have a full belly. You don't feel nervous that you don't have enough to eat anymore. You feel like you can think straight. You feel like you can plan well. You can live the life you were meant to live. We wish that for all Yoshvei Tevel, all dwellers of the land. Let us request, let us summon, let us beckon good food resources for the full satisfaction of all dwellers of the land, all dwellers of the planet.
Can we sing it again?
Yeah, we can sing it one more time. Let's do it one more time, and then we'll say goodbye for today. Nodeh le'ein hachayim, hazana et hakol, al haaretz hatova,
This one, but I'm just trying to understand it.
harchava. Nishmorna, nishmorna, vehi tekaimenu, unevakesh mazon lehasbi'a bo, kol yoshvei tevel. Just do the last part. Unevakesh mazon lehasbi'a bo, kol yoshvei tevel. I'm gonna fix this little letter here so it doesn't get on my nerves. If I do that, will it go? There.
You need to go get something to eat.
Yes. So that we can say the blessing. Yeah. So, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today. And may we all have the right amount of food to feed ourselves and to feed those in our midst. And never, not us or anyone, be in the position of having to sell ourselves just so that we can eat. So I'm getting a question. Is that from the Book of Blessings? Yes, it's from Marcia Falk's book of Blessings. Exactly. Should have said that.
Before we go, can I just make a plug? David Cuny, who's with us today,
Yes.
has a good to know class on Sunday at 4:00. So please look for the Zoom link and join us as David presents his book. David, do you want to give us a little bit?
Yeah. David, do you want to say a
Say
word
something.
about your?
Yeah, the book is called On Rockingham Street, and the title of my talk is American Judaism Hanging by a Thread. And I try to show the collision and relationship between the New Pew Report and the story of my family and their journey from Vilna. And I talk really about both. There's a story element and a Pew Report discussion. So I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Thank you, David.
Wonderful. So thank you. Thank you all